Hi, I'm Sam. The Magic 2010 set introduces a number of new terms to the game. These are permanent switches to the words we use for certain aspects of the game because the new terms are more accurate, more flavorful, and make more sense. However, until you get used to them, they may be confusing, especially because they'll coexist with cards from previous sets that use the old terms. This is an incredibly rare occurrence. We review and revise the rulebook to this extent only once every 10 years. This video will introduce new terms, explain what they mean, and show them side by side with the old terms. Ready? Then let's start with the big one. This is the battlefield. It's the place where your lands, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, and planeswalkers go. This area used to be known as in play, which was a pretty bland way to refer to the place next to your graveyard and library. Here's a before and after example. The old Howl of the Night pack referred to putting tokens into play. The new Howl of the Night pack refers to putting tokens onto the battlefield. Here's another before and after. Sage Owl used to have a comes into play ability. Now it has an enter the battlefield ability. That's an important point. If a creature has an ability that triggers when it enters the battlefield, it doesn't trigger when it attacks. It triggers when you put it down on the table. This whole area is the battlefield, whether you're in combat or not. Here's another big change. This one actually returns to the early days of the game. For years, the action of taking a spell, paying its cost, and seeing if it resolves was known as playing that spell. Now when you do this, you're casting that spell. You can find cards from 10 years ago that say cast on them, but we retired that term a while back. The funny thing was, players never stopped saying cast. It's a cooler term, it's a more evocative term, and it's once again the current term. Let's do a side-by-side. It's exactly the same, except plays changed to casts. The word play used to cover a lot of ground. You would play lands, play spells, and play activated abilities. Now, appropriately enough, you activate activated abilities. An activated ability has a cost, a colon, and an effect, like the one on Dragon Whelp. The Whelp's ability refers to how many times it was activated in a single turn. The upshot is that you play a land, cast a spell, and activate an activated ability. Some cards will still use the word play in the broader sense. They'll talk about playing a card without specifying whether that card is a land or a spell. In those cases, you do what's appropriate. If it's a land, you play it, and if it's a spell, you cast it. Some cards, like Resounding Silence, tell you to remove something from the game. When you do that, the card you remove doesn't stray too far. You just put it off to the side in a game area that used to be known as the removed from the game zone. This zone is now known as the exile zone, and cards that told you to remove something from the game will now tell you to exile that thing. Not only is it much shorter, it's also more accurate. Here's the dirty little secret. Things that have been removed from the game are actually still in the game. They stick around in case they return to where they came from, which could happen if Oblivion Ring is destroyed. They can be targeted by spells like Pull from Eternity. Some abilities, like Suspend, work in the removed from the game zone, and some cards, like Fungal Behemoth, affect the game from there. Here's Haunting Echoes, which shows the terminology switch. It works the exact same way, only the labels are changing. One last change to talk about. For years, there's been confusion between effects that last until end of turn and abilities that trigger at end of turn. Why? Because they happen at different times. Abilities that trigger at end of turn actually trigger here, at the beginning of the end step. That's not the end of the turn at all. By contrast, effects that last until end of turn wear off in the cleanup step. Unless something unusual happens, this actually is the very last thing that happens in a turn. The most confusing thing about abilities that trigger at end of turn is what happens if that kind of ability is created during the end step. In that case, we've already passed the trigger point, which is the beginning of the end step, so the ability waits until the next end step begins, all the way near the end of the following turn. That's why we changed how this is written. Now abilities like this clearly state that they trigger at the beginning of the end step. It's a nice parallel to the abilities that trigger at the beginning of your upkeep. Well, that covers all the new terminology. In all of these cases, only the words have changed. The cards all work the same way they always did. They just do so more clearly.